Good evening, everyone. I'm David Brigham. I'm the librarian and CEO here at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. I'm excited to introduce our speaker this evening, Richard Vague, on the topic of July 1776, the contentious vote for independence. First, though, a few housekeeping details. We are hybrid tonight, so I just want to share with everybody that if you're viewing online, you can click the CC button to receive closed captions. We will be recording tonight's program, and we'll be sending that out to everyone who registered. So those of you in the room and those of you online will receive a YouTube video if you want to watch it again. We will have time for a few questions at the end, so please stick around for that. And there will be an online version where we'll show some of the documents that are here in the room. These will be here both for our guests that are physically here with us, and we'll have at least a few that we'll broadcast into the video. For our in-person audience, we do encourage you to see these documents. They were chosen specifically for tonight to highlight Richard's theme and some very precisely into his thesis. A bit of a digression and placing this evening in context. 2026 is obviously a very big year for Philadelphia and for HSP in the context of commemorating our nation's 250th birthday. We began celebrating last year with the 250th anniversary of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, the United States Marines, and Navy, all of which were founded in Philadelphia in 1775. Currently on view in the display cases, and they have drawers, so what you see on the decks is just a quarter of the exhibit, is an exhibit called The Changing Faces of Independence, which looks at how migration and immigration have shaped our nation. And this is a two-part exhibit. So part one looks at the demographics of the nation in 1876 at the first 100-year anniversary. And it specifically focuses in on Irish, African-American, and German populations in Pennsylvania and in the nation. Our second installment will look at the nation in 1976, so the bicentennial, and we'll be focusing on Italian, Polish, and Chinese immigrants. So obviously that's not everyone, but we really wanted to look at the way that our nation has changed and evolved through migration and immigration, and how we can see ourselves in our nation's history, whether our ancestors were here in 1776 or not. This summer, I'm co-organizing an exhibit with Bill Ewald, who is the constitutional law professor at the University of Pennsylvania. And our exhibit is called Paths to Independence, 1765 to 1787. And HSP is very rich in documents from that founding era, literally hundreds of thousands of original manuscripts, publications, broadsides, newspapers, engravings, political cartoons, and all of those will be in the exhibit, examples of those. These documents include some of the things that are from our summer exhibition, including John Dickinson's handwritten notes of a speech that he delivered on July 1st, 1776, arguing against declaring independence. So we'll hear from Richard in some detail about that theme. Our distinguished speaker, Richard Vague, is the author of 6 books on technology, innovation, and financial history. His latest book, which I hope you'll take home with you tonight, is called The Banker Who Made America, Thomas Willing and the Rise of the American Financial Aristocracy. And it draws heavily upon the collections here. We're very proud of that Richard relied on us and that we were able to deliver for him. 2 days ago, Richard's book earned an extensive rave review by Adam Gopnik in The New Yorker. And I'm just going to read a brief excerpt from that lengthy and insightful book that will, Richard's talk will make you want to read it, but Adam gives you more reason to want to read it. He writes, Vague is especially good at explaining why the British demanded the notorious taxation without representation and why the colonists responded so furiously. British banks, and with them, the British government had, after fighting wars in Europe, sunk into an almost absurd level of debt, producing bank failures, and in 1772, something like a great recession at home. In effect, the mother country turned to its thriving colonies to pay the bill for its European wars. The so-called Intolerable Acts, as well as the Stamp Act and the tax on tea that enraged Boston's patriots, were efforts by the British government to claw back money from the colonies to cover the imperial deficit, end quote. In addition to his accomplishments as a historian, Richard is a leading American entrepreneur and the founder of 3 successful companies in the energy and credit sectors. He is chair of the board of the Public School Employees Retirement System, which is the largest public pension fund in Pennsylvania, and he served as the Secretary of Banking and Securities for the Commonwealth. He currently serves on the boards of the University of Pennsylvania and Penn Medicine, as well as on a number of business boards. Please welcome Richard Vague.
It's such a great pleasure to be here, to see so many good friends and new friends. I did benefit enormously from David Brigham and Justina Barrett and others here at the HSP, which is they have 22 million documents here. You're sitting among 22 million documents, many of which are priceless. There's a handwritten, hand-edited copy of the Constitution here that I think alone is worth more than the building or something like that. So this was a bedrock of our activity, and I can't thank you guys enough. And I can't thank this audience enough for all the support you've given me over so many years. I've just written a book about Thomas Willing, but tonight's talk is not going to be about Thomas Willing per se. It's going to be about something that happened that was really important in his life, but in the life of the country. And that's the Declaration of Independence, the vote, which occurred on July the 2nd of 1776. So here goes. On May 18th, 1774, just after the British, furious about the Tea Party, shut down Boston Harbor, Paul Revere himself rode into Philadelphia to beg Pennsylvania to join a boycott. He asked, quote, "May we not rely on your suspending your trade with Great Britain?" But Pennsylvania's government, known as the Assembly, ignored his request. At the same moment, Virginia's House of Burgesses was calling on all colonies to form committees of correspondence to plan a coordinated response to the Intolerable Acts. 11 colonies would do so. Pennsylvania refused. Are you surprised by this? Well, then let me take it one step further. 2 years later, on July 1st, 1776, Pennsylvania's delegates to the Second Continental Congress voted against independence. That happened in large part because they were instructed to vote against it by their own state government. Let that sink in. This evening, I will tell you why they voted against it and how that mortifying act was overturned. You see, at that volatile moment, Pennsylvania was divided roughly into 2 political camps. One camp was comprised of the Philadelphia elite, largely merchant traders who sent their ships around the globe, who ruled that state's government and were closely tied to their counterparts in England. They were deeply entangled with British wealth and largely did not see the need for independence. They weren't loyalists by and large. Most were simply business people who wished the whole thing would just blow over. The second opposing camp was largely comprised of Scotch-Irish Presbyterians and other non-Anglican immigrants, Anglicanism being the official religion of Britain. They were the so-called, and this is a phrase used at the time, they were called the so-called middling and lower sorts, terms for the middle and lower classes who had been flooding into Pennsylvania. They were the colony's artisans and farmers, especially on the frontier of Western Pennsylvania. They were often directed west by the elite to serve as a human buffer against the Native American attacks. The assembly would routinely neglect their needs, especially for protection, as made clear by a Philadelphia newspaper editor who wrote, quote, "The back countries are a dead weight upon us. They pay very little towards the support of our government." More than 50,000 of these renegades had arrived in the Delaware Valley in the mid-1700s, and they had very different needs and views than the merchant elite. Their very arrival was transforming Pennsylvania from a colony that was cooperative with the king into one that was vigorously resistant. These new colonies had, quote, "a fierce individualism, which saw every man as the basic equivalent of every other and defied authority of every kind." These very middling and lower sorts would emerge as the radical political and economic foil to these merchant elite. Tonight, I'll refer to them as radicals and middling and lower sorts and commoners, though this faction's leadership had plenty of wealth. During their long years in Northern Ireland and Scotland under Britain's thumb, these commoners had been politically and economically oppressed, suffering disadvantage and hardship, and had ample cause for hate toward the English. They were mostly Presbyterian, a rogue anti-authoritarian religion that stood apart from the official Anglican Church. And they were the debtors and tenants of the merchant elite. In fact, the colony's courts would become a fault line between the elite and the commoners, since courts became viewed as the enforcement agent of the elite. Over time, as they gained power, these radicals would act to ban the theater. So we're learning a little bit more about these guys. They would act to ban the theater, to deny funding to the American Philosophical Society, and shut down the University of Pennsylvania in 1779 as being too elite. Even the raging yellow fever epidemics of the 1790s carried this political polarization. Radicals favored the method of bloodletting, and the elite a more palliative alternative. Culture wars were present in 1776. The leaders of this radical faction had a burning contempt for the colony's financial elite that still echoes today. The conservative Thomas Smith would characterize their contempt as asserting, quote, "Know ye, we despise you." The elites had little appetite or desire for a true democracy and would come to label this faction pejoratively as, quote, "the democracy," because of their insistence they be included as voters. For radicals, that was a term of pride. Some historians refer to this elite versus radical dichotomy in Pennsylvania as one of urban globalists versus rural localists. These radicals looked inward and westward, while the financial elite looked outward and across the ocean. It was a battle of the coast versus the interior. This same divide has lingered, echoing through the centuries to our own politics in the 21st century as a persistent division forged by culture wars, finance, morph into the Federalists. Now let's get back to Paul Revere. Radicals were infuriated by the Assembly's rejection of his request for help and its refusal to form a committee of correspondence. So just a few days later, on May 20th, 1774, in an epic-making moment, these radicals made an audacious maneuver. At an emotionally charged meeting held at the brand new City Tavern at 2nd and Walnut, they formed an extra-legal committee, the City Committee, to try and do what the Assembly would not. By extra-legal, we mean wholly outside of the legal government. It meant that these radicals had no authority other than their own convictions. More than 200 of these Philadelphians attended. This committee, formed in the spirit of the committees of correspondence that have been used on occasion in times past, would circumvent the Assembly and devise its own response to Paul Revere. This was all shrewdly orchestrated by the radical Charles Thompson in conjunction with Thomas Mifflin and Joseph Reed. Just before the meeting, they persuaded the more moderate John Dickinson, who had earned his credibility in his writings against the Townshend Acts, to join them. You're going to see plenty of Dickinson stuff over there. This committee would sagely resist reaching for too much authority or demanding too much from the Assembly. Instead, at this early moment, it sought only to recommend delegates to a brand new fangled colony-wide thing called the Continental Congress to convene in Philadelphia, rather than recommending the further step of a boycott. Over time, it would quietly usurp other duties away from an increasingly indecisive and beleaguered assembly. When the boycott was finally enacted, it was the City Committee that was its diligent and tough enforcer. A full year later, after the famous shot heard round the world, Lexington, this committee would organize militias. And this is all outside the structure of Pennsylvania's assembly. It would organize militias, suppress dissent, and help prepare for war. These radicals also worked to increase their influence in the official side of things, campaigning for more seats in the assembly. And though they never attained a majority, they gained enough seats to block a quorum, a power they would soon enough wield dramatically. The atmosphere in the colonies was turning more venomous and tense. By the fall of 75, radical passions were growing, and with that, civil liberties were crumbling. Somebody was talking earlier about a tarring and feathering that occurred at this point. The radicals, if you weren't moving the right direction, you were in trouble. There were serious civil liberty infractions during this era, including tarring, feathering, and later mass and arbitrary arrests. By years in 75, these radicals were beginning to whisper the language of independence. They were for it, but they were for much more than that. Their protest against Britain was also a protest against the elite within the borders of the colonies. They longed for a new egalitarian democracy without class. They had long resented economic oppression, and this conviction had been reinforced by the egalitarian and anti-authoritarian ethos of the Great Awakening that had thundered across America starting in about 1740. Indeed, for many radicals, this egalitarian vision had become a large part of what animated their quest for independence. This radical group included small local merchants, mechanics, artisans, unskilled labor, and most of all, farmers. They'd been beleaguered economically in the years immediately before. Their standard of living was actually going down fairly precipitously in the years prior to 1776. and the idea that railed against inequality as they sought an economic leveling. As 1776 dawned, this internal Pennsylvania revolution, this battle between the merchant elite and the radicals, was moving toward a monumental climax that would determine the fate of the new nation. The more Britain used armed force to punish Americans, the more it alienated them. Then, in January 1776, Thomas Paine's incendiary pamphlet, Common Sense, burned its path across the colonies with a demand for more than 100,000 copies. Common Sense was the first public piece to explicitly espouse independence, and it captivated the colony's radicals far more than it did the elite, who were largely still averse to the idea. The city's Quakers, who had kind of lost credibility gradually over time because of their resistance to protection from the Indians and their unwillingness to participate in any dialogue about independence, they rebuffed Common Sense entirely as, quote, the setting up and putting down of kings and governments is God's peculiar prerogative. For the time being, though, the Pennsylvania Assembly's anti-independence still held the majority of the electorate. As things stood in March of 1776, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Virginia were the three largest and most influential colonies. If there was to be independence, they all three had to agree. And Pennsylvania, opposed to independence, was the state that stood in the way. Let's talk about the individual states for a moment. The story of America's journey to independence is often told without much, if any, reference to the individual states. Yet the individual colonies or states were the primary form of government in America in 1776. They had been so for the better part of a century, and they would remain so until 1787, well after the Revolution. Each state would separately have to decide whether it wanted to respond to independence or to Britain, including the difficult question of boycotts and independence itself. One state could not force any other state into action, nor could the famed Continental Congress, which, for all we've read and heard and seen about it, was a hastily improvised body with weak and limited authority. Pennsylvania, the centermost state, was key to any rebellion. It would have been impossible for the combined colonies to have succeeded in any action against Britain, whether a boycott or an armed conflict, without Pennsylvania, because Britain could have readily prevented a united rebellion simply by establishing a major military force there, right in the middle of the 13 colonies. And Pennsylvania was the colony perhaps least inclined to act against Britain. Why, you might ask? You see, prior to the emergence of the radicals, prior to these middling and lower sorts pouring into the colony, there had been two main factions in Pennsylvania, both of them elite. The Penn family and its adherents, who had worked to curry favor with the king in order to keep a considerable tax advantage they had received. And on the other side, the wealthy leaders in the assembly, Quakers and Anglicans, who had resented that very Penn family tax advantage and had long lobbied the king to overturn it. An effort led by Ben Franklin himself. They wanted to convert Pennsylvania from a proprietary colony to a royal colony. And that would have caused Penn's tax advantage to disappear. So they hired a guy named Ben Franklin to go live in London and lobby for it. That was in addition to the bond that came with their deep commercial ties to the many British merchants that had made them all very wealthy. So both elite factions were motivated to ingratiate themselves to king and parliament. However, the emergence of these radicals had forced these two factions to merge together to try to block them. In 1776, the radicals knew all this and further knew that Pennsylvania's delegates to Congress had been instructed by the Assembly to vote against independence. They petitioned the Assembly to repeal these, quote, deadly instructions, only to be thwarted once again when the Assembly in 1776 ignored this request and reiterated their anti-independence instructions on April 6th. This is coming in July and it's April 6th. And they're reestablishing their opposition to independence. In the Pennsylvania elections in May 1776, so we're less than 60 days away from the moment of truth. Just 2 months before that moment of truth, conservative anti-independents held on to control of the Assembly, but just barely. Then two shocking and sudden events would swing the momentum to Pennsylvania's radicals. Just 6 days after those elections, news arrived that Britain had hired mercenary soldiers. This was a startling and consequential change, as defenders of the reconciliation with Britain had depicted the nascent war as a family dispute and nothing that would drive Britain to call in foreign troops. Ardent supporters of Britain, including the head of the University of Pennsylvania, had long declared that because Britain had not hired mercenaries, radicals could not justify independence, and reconciliation was still possible. Thus, King George's hiring of mercenaries was widely viewed as a betrayal and a boost for the radical cause. The second boost came on May 8th, when a British warship, the Roebuck, sailed up the Delaware River just right out here to do battle with Pennsylvania's new gunboats, sending Philadelphians into a panic. Behind the scene, radicals James Cannon, Thomas Young, Thomas McCain, and Christopher Marshall were furtively consulting with the more outspoken advocates of independence from other colonies, most notably Massachusetts' brilliant and increasingly prominent Samuel Adams and his younger second cousin, John. Together, they were infuriated with inadequate military funding and embarrassed by Congress's reluctance to declare independence. They saw that the anti-independents were mostly the privileged and believed these wealthy individuals had already bargained with the British and been pre-selected for pardons. They devised a simple yet brilliant strategy that would be a trap for the conservative elite. They would introduce a seemingly innocuous resolution before Congress recommending that each colony form a government no longer beholden to Britain. This resolution addressed an obvious question. What legitimacy did the 13 colonial governments have now that armed conflict had begun? Since all viewed themselves as having more authority than the Continental Congress, and all had been creations of the King and Parliament. By putting this resolution up for vote in Congress, John Adams, along with many like-minded leaders from Virginia, were challenging the very legitimacy of each of these 13 state governments. This resolution for the formation of local governments, pretty innocuous sounding, right? Read, quote, resolve that it be recommended to the respective assemblies and conventions of the United Colonies, where no government sufficient to the exigencies of their affairs had been hitherto established, to adopt such government as shall, in the opinion of the representatives of the people, best conduce to the happiness and safety of their constituents in particular, and America in general. How much more innocuous can you get? It was ingenious and deceptively simple, just a recommendation that applied only if an existing state government was deemed not sufficient to the exigency of affairs. It provided no criterion for whether a state government met that standard. Given the ambiguous wording, it was easy for Pennsylvania's assembly to blithely assume that it met this criteria. The Continental Congress passed this resolution on May 10th during the course of a busy day. In what might have appeared to be an afterthought, this resolution also called for a committee of 3 people be appointed to prepare a preamble to the foregoing resolution. The members chosen were John Adams from Radical, Massachusetts, and planters Edward Rutledge and Richard Henry Lee from Radical, Virginia. Dickinson was absent. He'd gone to Delaware to attend to personal affairs. And tactically, conservatives had blundered badly by not inserting someone from their camp as a co-drafter. John Adams pounced on this as an opportunity to push the implications of the resolution one bold step further and took the lead on that draft. He presented it to Congress for their approval on May 15th, 5 days later. Powerfully, it vastly expanded the significance of the May 10th resolution, reading, quote, "Whereas His Britannic Majesty has, by late act of Parliament, excluded the inhabitants of the United Colonies from the protection of his crown, and whereas no answer whatever to the humble petitions of the colonies for redress of grievances and reconciliation with Great Britain has been or is likely to be given, but the whole force of that kingdom, aided by foreign mercenaries, is to be exerted for the destruction of the good people of these colonies, it is necessary that the exercise of every kind of authority under the said crown should be totally suppressed for the defense of their lives, liberties, and property against the hostile invasions and cruel depredations of their enemies." It was a thunderbolt, every bit as bold and defiant, if not more so, as the language of Jefferson's Declaration approved less than 2 months later. It made the breathtaking claim that authority should pass from the crown to the people. This was in some respects a point of no return, effectively itself a declaration of independence. Within the confines of the Continental Congress, it was as galvanizing as Paine's common sense had been months earlier to the nation. Adams had sprung the trap, and Philadelphia's elite were now ensnared in it. Maryland's delegates were so upset with the result that they walked out of the session and would proceed no further without instructions from their constituents at home. Delaware delegate Caesar Rodney wrote that, quote, "The cool, considerate men think it amounts to a declaration of independence," end quote. Remember, this was on May 15th. In the debates in the preamble, James Wilson had argued, James Wilson, who just lived a couple of blocks from here and known as the father of the Constitution, Wilson had argued, in this province, if that preamble passes, there will be an immediate dissolution of every kind of authority, that people will be instantly in a state of nature. Why then precipitate this measure? Before we are prepared to build the new house, why should we pull down the old one and expose ourselves to all the inclemencies of the season, end quote. John Adams, on the other half, you know John Adams, you'll like this, was ecstatic. He wrote to his wife Abigail that he thought this was the new nation's Declaration of Independence, one that would earn him everlasting fame. He was wrong. Thomas Jefferson would secure that honor 2 months later. On that same day, a resolution of the Virginia Convention instructed its delegates to Congress to propose to that respectable body to declare the United Colonies free and independent states. It was another thunderbolt, an overt proposal for independence that would soon come before Congress. Adams' preamble and resolution had created an uproar. Emboldened, Pennsylvania's radicals sprang into action. Their extra-legal city committee now had in hand what was needed to carry out what was in essence a coup d'etat to destroy Pennsylvania's assembly and create a new state government out of whole cloth. They wasted no time. sending out handbills for a mass meeting to be held in the State House courtyard just 5 days later to call for a, quote, provincial convention. In the scheming minds of Adams, Marshall, and Cannon, the May 10th resolution had given congressional blessing for the city committee to call this provincial convention in order to form a new government, completely circumventing the assembly and proceeding solely on the basis of the city committee's authority. For 2 years now, remember this city committee gets started in the spring of 74. For 2 years, Pennsylvania's radicals had been patient tacticians. They had maneuvered carefully not to overreach at any point along the way. Now it was time to be bold. On May 20th, this mass meeting drew over 4,000 people in soaking rain in the State House yard. Standing in the rain, McCain and the other radical leaders read the May 10th resolution, the May 15th preamble, and to underscore the depth of the division as well as their hate, the detested November 9th Pennsylvania Assembly resolution forbidding congressional delegates to vote for independence. For some, their opposition on this day spilled over into rage. McCain called for a provincial conference and convention to form a brand new government to commence on June 18th, and the crowd roared their vote of approval. The day's events, as one person noted, had given the coup de grace to the king's authority in Pennsylvania. They then raced to ensure the radicals would dominate attendance at that newly called conference. Back in Pennsylvania's assembly, however, anti-independents were still in control, and they hastily tried to reform the existing government in order to conform after the fact with Adams' resolution, but to no avail. From this point forward, the assembly rapidly fell apart for the simple reason that there were now enough independents to prevent that body from achieving the necessary quorum. Radicals would use this tactic repeatedly and relentlessly, failing to show up in a blatant attempt to break the assembly's back. This denied the assembly a quorum on May 27th, June 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 10th, forcing the cancellation of its sessions. Hamstrung, the assembly reached out to Congress, which was meeting in the same building. That's one of the killers to me about this whole thing. Often they're 20 or 30 feet away from each other doing these things. In a pitiful and unsuccessful attempt to get Congress to overtly affirm its legitimacy. So here they are, this beleaguered state government. On the next floor is this weak new Continental Congress. They're going hat in hand to the Continental Congress, asking them to affirm their legitimacy. Continental Congress refused. The doomed Pennsylvania Assembly took one more step to try and assert its legitimacy by removing the hated prohibition against voting for independence. But it was far too late. On June 14th, the Pennsylvania Assembly died, never again to muster a quorum under its original 1701 charter, and there would be no more business before it. The internal revolution of the radicals against the merchant elite that had begun in May of 74, a slow motion coup d'etat of Pennsylvania, was now all but complete. The newly established provincial conference met starting June 18th to draft its new constitution and bring a new state government into being. Their members would complete their work in September of 76. Back in Congress on June 7th, things moved quickly. Virginia's Richard Henry Lee introduced the resolution for independence, and the next day the debates began. And we have a copy of the handwritten notes of one of the most important of dates on July 1st on that table. John Dickinson, James Wilson, and others spoke adamantly against even taking a vote, imploring their fellow delegates to wait until they had sought out the voice of the people. In acquiescence to those pleas, said, go home and talk to your constituents. In acquiescence to those pleas, the vote for independence was deferred to July 1st 1776, ostensibly to give delegates time to secure the guidance of the electorate in their respective colonies. Deliberations for independence took place against the ominous background of the Prohibitory Act passed by Parliament in December 75 in retaliation for the colony's bellicosity. That act had raised 26,000 British troops for an invasion of Boston, New York, Virginia, and North Carolina, the largest expeditionary force in Western history to that point. Led by General William Howe and his brother Admiral Richard Howe, it sailed into Boston, then sailed from Boston, arriving in New York Harbor on June 29, 1776. The congressional delegates heard this sobering news just before their scheduled July vote, lending an undertone of grim defiance and even fatalism to the proceedings. The first vote for independence came on July 1st. On that day, Congress would conduct this vote as a committee of the whole. Y'all remember they used that technique several times during this period. It was a preliminary and kind of non-binding vote prior to advancing the question for consideration by the full Congress. The Pennsylvania delegates had been appointed, instructed by a body, their assembly, that was now defunct. Nevertheless, they could legitimately claim that they had been given specific instructions not to vote for independence. Of the 7 Pennsylvania delegates in attendance, 2 of the 9 were absent altogether. 3 voted in favor of the motion and 4 against, including John Dickinson, Robert Morris, and Thomas Willing, the gentleman who the biography is about. So the 7 voting Pennsylvania delegates rejected independence 4-3. Pennsylvania voted no, but 9 states had voted yes, and that was enough to now advance to an official vote by Congress on the next day, July 2nd, 1776. The bald fact that only 9 states had voted for independence stared them in the face because what they truly needed was unanimity. The delegates were on edge. The next day, Congress voted again in an official vote of Congress. This time, Robert Morris and John Dickinson were pointedly absent, AWOL. Morris was particularly close to Franklin, and it is speculated that it was Franklin who had convinced Morris and Dickinson to be absent. That left only Willing and Humphreys to vote against the declaration, so our hero Thomas Willing voted against it twice in 2 days. So the Pennsylvania delegation's vote changed from no to yes, with 3 delegates for and now only 2 against. Edward Rutledge had been able to persuade South Carolina delegates to vote yes. An ailing Caesar Rodney had been sent through the night to break Delaware's tie. So 12 of the 13 colonies now voted yes on the resolution for independence. New York lacked instructions, so they abstained, though their provincial conference would vote to affirm on July the 9th. America had now passed the resolution for independence, a decisive turning point for the colonies, but Pennsylvania's delegates still voiced another serious objection, that this decision had been made by a small group of men, not by the broad population, through an officially conducted vote. In other words, not by a plebiscite. It was an argument that had and has genuine merit. The few were making a monumental decision on behalf of the many and without their specific assent. It was an objection that could have been legitimately leveled at many of the bodies, laws, and actions of this era, including the soon-to-be enacted Pennsylvania State Government Constitution of 76 and the epical U.S. Constitution of 1787 itself. It is a criticism that has been leveled at certain legislative bodies of the modern era, including the European Union. An angry John Dickinson proclaimed that the radical Presbyterian faction had destroyed assembly power and inappropriately drawn Pennsylvania into independence. The Pennsylvania Evening Post stated plainly, quote, "This day the Continental Congress declared the United Colonies free and independent states." July 2nd was the date of the vote, and yet the United States celebrates July 4th as the day for independence, likely because that is when the heavily scrutinized and frequently amended language of the Declaration of Independence, which was not yet final nor approved, was finally approved. Broadsides were available the next day, and I believe we actually have some of those in our collection here. At noon on July 8th, 1776, John Nixon gave Declaration of Independence its first public reading. The next evening, General George Washington assembled his thousands of Continental soldiers on the parade grounds in Lower Manhattan, where it was read again and was met with a rousing cheer. On August 2nd, 1776, the final engrossed copy of the Declaration was finished and ready for signature. America had crossed its Rubicon, its point of no return. Thank you.
Stay up here. If we have any questions in the room or on the Zoom, speak loudly so they can hear you.
So most writers say that the New Yorkers were sent here without instructions. I find that very implausible that a legislature would send people here with no instructions. Twice I've seen writers say the New Yorkers were sent here with instructions specifically not to vote for independence. I've never seen any writer provide a footnote as to the source of what they're saying. Is there an original source that tells us this?
There is not an original source that's definitive on this question. And I can tell you that perhaps part of the reason is there were so many people who just wish the whole thing would go away. So if this group is kind of is trying to, deflect the responsibility for making that decision, it's because I think that's what they were really trying to do. They were trying not to have accountability and responsibility. Now, it changed quickly after the vote because now they had an imprimatur from 12 other states and they had their cover. But to my knowledge, there's no definitive account of what their position was coming into the Continental Congress.
Yeah, what was the impact of the fact that there was a Continental Army and there was no countervailing military force and the mob was for independence? Wasn't that a practical compulsion on the situation?
Can you rephrase it? Alan, it's great to have you here, by the way. Thank you for coming. Can you rephrase that, please?
Washington had a Continental Army. They had guns. The mobs were heavily pro-independence in Philadelphia and in the colonies. If the vote had gone the other way, would anybody care? People with the guns wanted independence.
If you look at the couple of hundred years prior to that, starting with the beheading of Charles I in 1641, the Glorious Revolution in 1688, and others, there had been many occasions where they had taken up arms, but it had not led to a fundamental change. There had been a negotiated settlement. When Howe is in Philadelphia in 1778, he says to our protagonist, Thomas Willing, "We concede. We'll give you everything you were asking for in 1763. No questions asked. You can have representation. You can decide on your own taxes." So there was still a belief as late as 78, 2 years later, that there could be and yes, at that point in time, people would have laid down their arms and they would have reunited. That wouldn't have been a new thing. That had happened many times over the prior 2 centuries.
I would say it also struck me that the whole tactical situation seems very similar to the way the Soviet Union unraveled.
Well, it begins an era of revolutions, beginning in 1688 with the Glorious Revolution, America's Revolution, France's Revolution, and it keeps happening. So, yeah, scholars have spent a lot of time looking at the similarities.
Provinces from the central government.
and collapse of the overarching institution.
I think that's absolutely correct. Yes, ma'am.
I've always wondered, it's interesting what you said and very enlightening, so thank you. I've always wondered whether that sort of flex, if you will, in the British Constitution that you were just talking about, the possibility that one could resolve without further warfare, was not available to the leaders of the American Revolution. In part because they lived, for the most part, in a stratified society between enslaved people and enslavers. And for the leaders of the founding generation, who were overwhelmingly enslavers, could they have seen that gray area at all? Or was it truly for them either all or nothing? What do you think?
It's a fascinating point, and I think it has a lot of merit. To underscore what you were saying about England and Britain at that time, there was tremendous dissension around this from before the war. So to agree with and underscore your point, half of the folks in London didn't want us to go to war. They already had a tax burden. You know, at this point in time, you know, Americans are fussing about their taxes. Tax rates in England were higher than tax rates in America. They didn't want another war. It cost Britain 3.5 times more per annum to prosecute the war than it cost the American colonies. They had to transport. So there was enormous dissension during the entire war. And there were people that predicted before the war, there was no way we can win this war. There's no way we can keep it. And there were folks that said, by the way, the North American colonies are a money loser. We make a lot of money from the Caribbean. We're starting to make a lot of money from India. Why bother? You know, it was in, you know, King George's intransigence. So, but I think your point that maybe they had a wider divergence of opinions and more flexibility governmentally has merit. Yes, sir.
The last one.
You mentioned earlier about the Quaker segment of Philadelphia that's sort of deteriorating, not deteriorating, but diminishing in its influence. What happened in the 1770s? Because the Quaker merchants were certainly rich and probably leaned toward not having war with England, but was there any faction within the Quakers who were siding with the more radical view?
It's a great question. And there was tremendous divergence of opinion within the Quaker community. But what had been effectively happening is they were losing the number of seats they had in the assembly because of their position on defending the Western frontier. So more and more Anglicans and even a few Scotch-Irish Presbyterians were taking seats formerly held by Quakers. So that created great consternation among the Quakers. And there were some that were resolute against the war, some of which decided because there's a discussion of war, my faith won't allow me to run for a legislative position. So some voluntarily stepped down. And then there were others that felt, as you might imagine, that they ought to take the side of independence. So within the Quaker community, it was enormous dissension.
I want to thank you one more time and have everybody get that on the top. So our friends on Zoom, don't leave yet. We are going to take a look at a handful of the documents that we pulled. So our friends in the room will be able to see this in just a few minutes, when you'll be able to get up and take a look. Now, I'm going to turn it back over to David Brigham.
Great. Richard, that was a tremendous talk. Thank you so much for a very illuminating and I dare say entertaining presentation. That was really, what a great night that you gave to us this evening. So I want to thank Richard again. So Justina has charged me with brevity and restraint, which I'm not great at. So I want to extend 2 invitations before I talk about 3 documents briefly. May 7th is the opening for Paths to Independence, our next exhibition. I hope you'll join us. We'll have 141 items in that exhibit. And our speaker that night will be Mary Beth Norton, So it'll be a great follow-up to Richard's talk this evening. On June 10th, we have our annual Founders Gala. It's our big fundraiser, and I hope you'll join us for that. It's one of the most important ways that we support our mission to care for these documents and make them accessible to family historians, to students, to graduate students. So June 10th, we'll be honoring Ron Chernow, one of the great biographers of some of the founders. Ron's new book is on Mark Twain, so we'll be hearing about Mark Twain, but he promises some anecdotes of Mark Twain's perception of the founding generation. So we're not going to leave the theme. And we're also honoring Bonnie and Peter McCausland, two of our great philanthropists who are wonderful supporters of the study and pursuit of history that night. So the three documents that I'm going to talk about briefly, first over here is the declaration by the United Colonies of the reasons and the necessity of the right to take up arms. So this document is passed by Continental Congress almost a year to the day prior to the Declaration of Independence. And it's a two-sided broadside. On the back is the signature of John Hancock in type. But what this document does, it follows shortly after Lexington and Concord. And it basically is saying that we are being oppressed by the standing British Army. It's pretty hard to turn back from that. And it arrives in London almost simultaneously with the Olive Branch Petition, which is the last-ditch effort to preserve the colonies as part of Great Britain, because there are advantages to that, economic advantages, the cost of defense, et cetera. So we have a draft of the Olive Branch Petition. But imagine the Olive Branch Petition and this Declaration of the Right to Take Up Arms arriving in London almost simultaneously. Talk about and it really is, I think, very hard to turn back from that. This next item is a political cartoon that was published in London in a magazine. There were a number of magazines that had a mix of literary essays, political commentary, astronomical observations, all sorts of things. It's a general magazine. And we just acquired this, actually. We bought it at auction at Dominic Winter, which is a really interesting auction house in the UK. And it sadly was cut out of a magazine, but it also is the kind of thing that we see frequently in London during the Revolutionary era. And what's so interesting is that almost all of these political cartoons are very sympathetic to the American position, including the idea of taxation without representation. And I've looked at them closely from the Stamp Act throughout the crisis as it was perceived in England. The one time that they get upset with the colonies is when they send that Declaration of the Right to Take Up Arms. And then they publish a cartoon called The Parricide, where we are the wayward, not just the wayward child, but the Oedipal child that's going to kill the father. But in this cartoon, the central scene is of a carriage, and it's being driven by Lord Mansfield, who is the principal legal authority in England at the time. His passenger is King George III and Lord Bute, one of the prime ministers of the Revolutionary era. And the horses are labeled Pride and Obstinacy. So basically, the point of the cartoon is that Mansfield is about to drive the king over a cliff. In the distance, in the left, the colonies are represented, and they're on fire. And basically, the message is an economic one and a political one, that through pride and through just absolute refusal to hear the American perspective, this is going to blow up the United Kingdom, at least this side of the Atlantic. And with it is going to go an important economic resource. And there's a little devil figure in the sky, and he's carrying the national debt on his back. So the debt, and Richard's book really takes us into the financial history of the revolution is brought into this cartoon. It's a fascinating little document. It's only this big, but it's a very graphic expression of a lot of key ideas of the era from the British perspective. Richard also mentioned that the Declaration was disseminated in a number of ways. John Nixon's reading of it in the State House yard, which was said to have been attended by thousands of people on July 8th. This broadside is the first and only official printing printed by John Dunlap, the printer to Continental Congress. And we think there's not really agreement about exactly how many were printed, but somewhere between 100 and 200 of these were printed, and 26 are thought to survive. So that's a pretty small number, and you're getting to see one of those 26. This one is unique, and what makes this one different from the other 25 is that it has quotation marks, and we know that Jefferson, when he was preparing a speech, would mark them up with quotation marks, not because he was borrowing words from someone else, the way that we would use them, but the way that we might mark up a speech with a highlighter or a font change or something like that. They were breathing and pacing marks. So for example, the phrase that all men are created equal is contained in quotation marks because Jefferson was expecting that as the principal author of this document, he was going to be the one to read this in the State House yard. It's not how it played out. We know from contemporary accounts that Jefferson was regarded as perhaps the greatest writer of his generation, but not a very good speaker. So that is all embedded in this unique copy of a very rare document, the first printing of the Declaration. We also have on view for you the first newspaper printing, and newspapers were extremely important. There were 4 English language newspapers in Philadelphia in 1776. There were 2, maybe 3 German language newspapers. I can't remember the number exactly, but Benjamintown in the Pennsylvania Evening Post was the first on July 6th to print the Declaration in a newspaper. And newspapers were disseminated to a much wider audience, and they would also have been put on ships that would have gone to Baltimore, Annapolis. You know, they would have gone up and down the Atlantic coast. They would have reached the West Indies within a couple of days. So the newspapers were extremely important. And town made a break from the typical newspaper format, which was a folio, down to a quarto, which made it a lot less expensive to produce. And so we produced 3 copies a week, 3 issues a week, whereas competitors were only doing a weekly. And he would be the first to publish a daily newspaper as well. So those are just a few of, I think, the wonderful things that my colleague Emily King, who was here, she helped organize this event, brought out for you to see. And her selection was really a direct response to Richard's book and to the ideas embedded in it. So thanks to all of you for being members, for being supporters, for being researchers here. And thanks for joining us for this wonderful, I think, program. And please have a look at the documents. Thank you all.
So that's the first time